In this section, we're going to be talking all about radical equations, and we're going to be solving these equations that happen to have radicals, square roots, cube roots, things like that in them. Now, before we start in, I want to go back to just how do we solve regular plain old equations, and then we'll take that stuff that we already know and we'll apply it to things that have radicals in them. So let's say, for instance, that we wanted to solve an equation that looked like 3x plus 5 equals 14. How would we go about solving that? Well, and before you just jump into it and say, oh, well, that would be 3x equals, 9, da 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 da, think about what it is that we're doing. Our whole goal here is to get the x all by itself, right? The way that we isolate that variable. So, you think about it here. Our whole goal here is to isolate the variable. We do that by always doing the opposite operation, so that it's like we're peeling things away from the variable. So now, right here on the left-hand side, this says 3 times x and then add 5. So if we were to peel those things away, we'd have to do it in an opposite manner. So since, again, paying attention to the way I said it, I said 3 times x and then add 5. So let's get rid of the 5 first. And we would do that by doing the opposite operation. The opposite of adding 5 would be to subtract 5. And remember, we can do that as long as we do it to both sides. So now we end up with 3x equals 9. And keeping in mind, we are still trying to solve for x. So we have to do the opposite. This says 3 times x. So the opposite of multiplying by 3 would be to divide by 3. And then by doing that, now we have x equals 3. Okay, now, as we went through this, I realized that you guys are well past this stage at this point. But I want you to think about what it actually means to solve an equation, because that's going to get you through even as the equations get larger and more complex. Now, since we're going to be adding in roots, radicals, we need to talk about what is the opposite of those operations. Because remember, when you're solving equations, you're just basically doing the opposite. So think about, what is the opposite of the square root? Well, the opposite of that would be to square. Remember that if you have a square root, we square to get rid of that square root. Same thing with the cube root. The opposite of the cube root would be to cube. If we had a cube root, and let's say we had x cubed underneath there, those would cancel each other out. They're the opposite operation. One undoes the other. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go through working these problems. And remember, our whole goal is always to isolate the variable by doing the opposite operations.